First of all, good evening. Thank you for coming tonight to our panel presentation on Amazon's HQ2 and its impact on local housing. So my name is Eric Maribojic. I'm the director of the Center for Real Estate Entrepreneurship at the George Mason School of Business. For those of you who don't know us, the center is the university's platform for connecting with the real estate industry through education, training, event programming, and collaborations on thought leadership and research on real estate-related issues that affect the quality of life of our communities. Accessible and affordable housing have been growing challenges, and the long-anticipated announcement of the many jobs coming from Amazon provide us with a new opportunity to examine the housing needs of our area. I hope that this event promotes a continued discussion in new ways to plan, design, develop, and build adequate housing so that we can continue to attract and retain the jobs of the future which will diversify our economy. We are pleased to partner in this objective with the Northern Virginia Association of Realtors and the Northern Virginia Apartment Association. And I'd like to introduce Ryan Conrad, the CEO of the Northern Virginia Association of Realtors, and Ludwig Gaines, the Executive Director of the Northern Virginia Apartment Association, to add their welcomes.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ryan Conrad, and I'm the CEO of the Northern Virginia Association of Realtors, and we're really pleased to be a strategic partner for tonight's program. Our organization represents over 13,000 real estate professionals who transact over 22,000 sales valued at over $13 billion annually in the Washington, D.C. metro area. But realtors are more than just real estate agents. They subscribe to a code of ethics that holds them to a higher standard with how they treat their peers, with their clients, and the public. The selection of Arlington as an Amazon HQ2 location has certainly generated a great deal of interest, as we could tell when this event sold within a day that it was advertised, so thank you for being here. And we also have about 200 or so of our realtors watching live streaming from our headquarters in Fairfax, so let's say a hello to them out there. The Amazon announcement is exciting because it highlights our region's strong infrastructure, our talented workforce, our stable business climate, and our robust housing market. It presents an excellent opportunity for realtors to be an invaluable community resource. In fact, we've already been approached by business leaders and media outlets for our members' perspective on the impacts of HQ2. We'll do our part to ensure that realtors, business leaders, and the community are informed about the housing demands created by Amazon's move. We believe our local economy and our housing market are positioned to absorb these new needs. But we know there's questions, and there may be challenges. The arrival of HQ2 will create demand for housing, and the increased demand will likely cause higher home prices and rental rates. And that's why we're here tonight, to learn from our region's experts about what we might expect and how we can work together to serve the community and ensure that Northern Virginia remains a viable place to live, work, and play. We'll continue to collaborate with industry leaders and strategic partners to remain a valued resource for residents and employees of Amazon, as well as other companies relocating to our region. As HQ2 generates housing demand and the impact of its arrival unfolds, the realtor community will be here to help guide the future of our region and enhance Amazon's presence in Northern Virginia. Thank you so much and enjoy the program.
Thank you, Brian, and good evening, everyone. My name is Ludwig Gaines, and I am the Executive Director of the Northern Virginia Apartment Association. And on behalf of our Board of Directors and our entire membership, representing well over 100 members with $2 billion plus of assets in this local market, we are delighted to partner with George Mason University and with NVAR, and it is our pleasure to welcome all of you to tonight's symposium. I see many of our member organizations in the audience, but for those who may not know, NVAA was founded in 1954. It's the local region's premier membership association covering multifamily housing. We represent apartment owners, apartment managers, as well as the vendors who ably service the multifamily housing industry. I will say I'm happy to see the seats filled and so many people watching online. When Eric and I first discussed how we would treat Amazon's potential appearance here in Northern Virginia, we decided we'll wait for a decision. And well, that decision came. And we are delighted. I will honestly say, for our economy, our industry in the region, this has brought tremendous excitement. It has brought tremendous promise, and it has brought uncertainty. Many of us have many questions, and I think part of tonight's event is to help us answer and navigate what's to come. I will say, and I think this is testament to all of you here in the audience, that we didn't know if anyone would show up. But you have, and we are so excited. Proximity to the holidays, I guess, is trumped by our excitement about the unknown and our desire for answers. We've had our ear to the ground, and what we've consistently heard through all of our members and others, through the media that's called our offices and our members that want to know, is what are we to expect? We put together a panel that I think of local, regional, and national experts that will begin to answer some of those questions for us. And for this, I'm grateful to our panelists who have dedicated their time and their efforts and their energies to putting together their presentations. Thank you. This is the first step in navigating this exciting issue. And for us, we consider you partners as well in this endeavor. So without that, I am the only one between you and the introduction of our speakers and presenters, and I'm going to be quiet despite my prior political election status. I will not be a politician tonight. I will walk and exit stage left, and I will leave it to the experts to share with you all, hopefully, what will begin to be a very important dialogue. I will plug April 24th, which is our Northern Virginia Apartment Summit for those in the multifamily housing industry. We hold it right here in this venue. It is a day-long event we do along with George Mason University. And if I don't get to say this to you personally before we leave, season's greetings and happy holidays, and thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Ryan and Ludwig. We'll now begin our panel presentations. So the format we have is each panelist will give their presentation, after which all 6 panelists will come together on stage to answer audience questions. So please hold any questions you have till the end. Our first presenter is Jeanette Chapman, Deputy Director of the Stephen S. Fuller Institute at the George Mason Schar School of Policy and Government, who will set the stage on what the Amazon workforce might look like and their housing needs.
So let's see if my lapel mic is on. Nope, not yet. Well, I'm going to wander, so, well, okay. I am Jeanette Chapman. Eric, thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you for having me here. As Eric said, I am going to be setting the stage in 2 ways. Firstly, I'm going to look at the broader context of the Washington region and how Amazon fits with that. And then secondly, I'm going to go through some forecasts of housing demand from the Amazon workforce and the spin-off effects. Or I'm going to exit out of my presentation. There we go. So to start with the context, the Washington region is not Seattle. We are very, very different. And one of the biggest things that I want everyone to take away from tonight, from my presentation, is that the Washington region is much larger and has a much higher baseline of activity. And therefore, Amazon won't affect our housing market in the exact same way that it did the Seattle market. We are already a larger area. We have 3.3 million jobs. Seattle has 2 million jobs. The land area of both metro areas is about the same. Seattle's not that much smaller than we are. And so in terms of density, we're a much denser area on a metro level. And so our job market activity is much, much higher. The general percentages are we are between 50 and 70% higher in our activity levels, depending on whatever metric you're looking at. So this is jobs, it's the same for people, it's the same for households, and it's been the same for almost 30 years. So again, integrating 25,000 jobs into our job market will look and feel very different than it did for Seattle, just because we're larger. Larger base, smaller percentage. Similarly, Arlington County is actually denser than Seattle, which I think is surprising to some people because we sometimes think of Arlington as more suburban, and it is more suburban compared to the district, which is our central business district area, but it's not more suburban compared to Seattle. It is a lot smaller in terms of land area. It's only 26 square miles compared to 83. So the absolute numbers are smaller. But on a per square mile basis, Arlington County has slightly more residents, and it has almost twice the concentration of private commercial office space. And when you incorporate the government space, it's going to be over twice as concentrated. And so the position of Arlington County to absorb workers is very different than the position of even Seattle to absorb this workforce. In terms of the job counts that we're talking about here, the 25,000 jobs are those blue bars. This is from the employment build-out schedule that's in the Commonwealth's Memorandum of Understanding. The 25,000 is what the Commonwealth is referring to as phase 1. There's also a phase 2 that isn't making the headlines, but it's in the Memorandum of Understanding that actually pulls us up to about 38,000 jobs. And that's the number that I'm going to be using because it's the largest possible universe for the metrics that we can go on. And it's not that different than the 50 that we were started with the announcement. If you annualize that 38,000 over 16 years, which is the current total build-out phase, it amounts to about 2,400 jobs per year. That's that yellow line. The blue bars are our year-over-year job growth on a metro level going back to 2000. And this is just to provide some context for what the order of magnitude is for the job growth that Amazon will bring compared to what we typically have. And over our past 16-year period, which includes both sequestration, which is here, and the recession, which is that decrease in 2009, the Amazon would have accounted for about 7% of that growth. That's not zero, but it's also not double. And so the context here is important. Similarly, for Arlington County, the difference between the Amazon-specific jobs that are forecasted to come and what typically happens, it's within the realm of historic norms. It will be an increase compared to what it has happened, but the increase will be the equivalent of moving from a 2016 level of job growth to a 2015 level of job growth. And I don't think that the county, if you think about what happened between those 2 years for the county, we really could pull apart the difference between what 1 year did versus the other because the trends were already in place. Similarly, the Arlington County, because of its position within the region, it's affected by the trends that occur elsewhere. So what happens in the district has an impact, what happens in Fairfax has an impact, and vice versa. Arlington County is small, so there are other factors at play. And one of the ways you can look at what the other factors are is we can forecast out the housing demand of Amazon based on the current patterns of job holders in the county, ages, wages, and the like. And we did that for the HQ2 workers, which is that column on the left, but we also did it for what we call indirect and induced effects. So all of the jobs that will come to support the normal business operations and the normal household growth. So you can think about admin, support services, normal business services, plus personal care services, restaurants, retail, that will just be generated because of the operation spending that then rolls into the household spending. The important part here is that that almost doubles the number of households. So in some ways, the forecasts that I'm going to show you are the largest possible universe of people that we can attribute specifically to Amazon. It's an intentional overestimate, again, so that we can try to think about the order of magnitudes that are involved. When it comes to the direct Amazon workforce, all of the jobs we know are going to be located in Arlington or slightly, some of them will be in Alexandria, but more or less in Arlington. That's where the critical mass will be. And unsurprisingly, the commuting patterns are going to heavily favor communities inside the Beltway. About 75% are inside the Beltway. But they aren't all going to be in Arlington. Arlington does not house all of its job holders, and it's very unlikely that it will for Amazon workforce. People and households have different preferences. They have a variety of needs. Some of them will have families, and they will have children and different considerations. And so they will distribute across the region, although this distribution will be heavily centered towards the Arlington side. However, when you add in the indirect and induced effects, so those jobs don't need to be in Arlington. They'll be spread out a little bit more across the region. The map here will flatten out. The households distribute a little bit more evenly overall because of these indirect and induced workforce. The overall commuting patterns in this respect are going to be a little bit flatter. Most of these households are going to be owners based on at full build out. Once everyone's settled, there's turnover that will happen over the course of that 16-year. But essentially, because of their implied household incomes, they're more likely to be owners here. And the number of owners is in the column on the left. And just for comparison, to add some context, the number of closed sales in each of these jurisdictions or combinations of jurisdictions are on the right. And you can see pretty easily that all of the number of owners is smaller than a year's worth of sales. In 2017, you can make an assessment as to whether or not that's the right year to base this against, but it's better than a bubble year. Those owners are going to come over the course of 16 years, come and buy over the course of 16 years. And so if you assume that the next 16 years will look exactly like 2017, the demand from new owners is only going to increase the demand in each of these markets by between 1% and 5%. Again, that's not nothing, but it's not the entirety. There's already a lot of demand here, and the incremental increase that will result from Amazon will be relatively small. The same thing goes for the renters. So the largest demand for on a percentage basis for rentals is going to be in Amazon. Those workers, you can think of them more of what we are the press is trying to tell us, that all Amazon workers are 25 and renters. That's where you're seeing this. Realistically, though, many of them will be older. They'll follow an age distribution that's skewed younger, but that doesn't mean there are no older homeowners in the mix, and so that's where you're seeing this. So again, with the rental numbers, though, these renters are going to be coming over 16 years. And so when you annualize that percentage increase that's on the far right there, it's less than 0.5 percentage point per year. And that's not nothing, but we see a lot of that anyway because of our magnitude of job growth. The second big caveat with these workers is that they have higher incomes. They have higher household incomes because by definition, all of these households have income. So that's not true of all current residents. Some residents are retired or they're students. That's not in the mix for the Amazon workforce. So right now, the Washington region's median income is about $100,000. So half of our households have incomes that are less than $100,000. The Amazon workforce, and this includes both direct and indirect, that's 24%. So 24% of them will have incomes less than $100,000. That has very different implications for the housing market on both the for sale and the rental. And when you separate them out, you can see that there's still a really large difference between both the likely renters and the likely owners. The rental side, the renters have incomes that are about 70% higher than the current rental households. Owners, it's about 50. So the average renter in this, from an HQ2 perspective, can afford a rent of about $3,400. The average household size for HQ2 renters is about 2.5, so they're going to be looking for 2 or 3 bedrooms. At $3,400 in this area, you can probably find new construction for that. That's a different market than what our current residents are looking for with their $7,500 or their $77,000 incomes. So, as I mentioned before, there's going to be a variety of housing demanded by HQ2 workers and the related workforce, just like there are for all businesses. They aren't all going to be one type. And so when you look at what the percentage gain is compared to where we are now across the board at a region-wide level, it's between 2.5% and 3.5%, broad strokes. The demand, as is mentioned before, is going to be slightly stronger for ownership. It's actually going to be clustered in the single-family attached. So an important caveat here is that these forecasts are agnostic about supply. They look at what the typology of worker is and push that out towards the forecast and assume that they can find what they're looking for in this housing stock and at this price point. There are still going to be a lot of multifamily and a lot of single-family detached as well. So there's going to be a variety, there are going to be niches. And what that does, though, it dilutes the overall effect of these workers. If they all did one thing, that would be a problem. But they're not, it's very unlikely that all of these workers will have the exact same preferences. So the last thing I'm going to circle back to is a little bit more context, because one of the conversations that I've been hearing is that there's concern that all of the Amazon workforce, or a large number of the Amazon workforce, is going to be imported. We do that already. So 65% of our workforce right now was born outside of DC, Maryland, or the entire Commonwealth of Virginia. And it varies by industry. We import more of our specialized workforce compared to our retail trade and our residential serving workforce. So in that respect, Amazon's really not that different, and any growth that we have in the professional and business service sector is likely to import new workers. That's part of the natural cycling of things. So just to recap, we're bigger than Seattle. That has 2 important implications. Firstly, it's going to dilute the overall effect of Amazon. And then secondly, it means that the presence of Amazon's not going to substantially change existing trends. So that means that the job growth that we saw earlier, that extra 2,400, will increase a little bit, but it's not going to change the direction or the magnitude. Similarly, our existing needs aren't going to be substantively altered because of Amazon. Our infrastructure needs, we know what they are. They've been here before Amazon. They will continue to exist. Our affordable housing needs, again, we know what they are. They will continue to exist with or without Amazon, and Amazon's only going to result in an incremental change in that. The next point is that the workforce is different and the same in important ways and in ways that affect the housing market. So the higher average incomes mean that these households will be more able to afford new construction overall, and they will also likely result in a larger fiscal, more tax revenues compared to existing residents, which means that the state and local governments will have more ability to leverage these new workers to help existing workers and residents. And then lastly, as I mentioned before, we already import a lot of our workforce. That's going to continue to happen. That's going to continue to happen with Amazon, and it's going to continue to happen with the federal government, with all of our professional business service workers and our contractors. And with that, I will hand it off back to Eric, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeanette. So we'll pivot now to looking at the Amazon potential impact on for sale housing. And we have Danielle Hale, the chief economist of Realtor.com, who will tell us what the impact is on for sale housing in depth.
All right. So as Eric mentioned, I'm the chief economist at Realtor.com. We're based out of Santa Clara, California, but I happen to work and live in this area, so I'm excited to talk about this local topic. I've been at Realtor.com for about a year and a half now, but before that I was at the National Association of Realtors, which has a research shop here in the DC area. So I've been in the area for a long time and been studying real estate for a long time. So I have a good background to talk about this topic. So here's how I'm going to frame the impact on for sale housing. First, I'm going to talk about the current state of for sale housing in the Northern Virginia, DC area. Talk a little bit about how the typical Amazon worker fits in, though not with as much detail as Jeanette covered for you, since she gave a great background. And then talk about some of the lessons learned from what we saw in the for sale housing market in Seattle. As Jeanette mentioned, there are ways that this area is like the Seattle area and ways that we're different. And obviously a lot of other factors going on at the same time as Amazon was expanding in Seattle. So it's not exactly what will happen here, but it does give a good indication of what could happen. And what we've seen already in the real estate market. So Amazon made the announcement official a month ago tomorrow, and we are seeing that people are starting to take advantage. There is at least a bit of an Amazon effect in the traffic that we're seeing and in the way listings are being advertised. So we'll talk about that. So the current state of the housing market in the Northern Virginia, Washington, D.C. metro area, one is that, like a lot of metro areas across the country, we fall behind the U.S. when it comes to homeownership rate. Not substantially. The homeownership rate here in the Washington region, on average, overall, is 61% versus 64% nationally. But like we see in most other parts of the country, the more urban the area, the lower the homeownership rate tends to be. And of course, the area that Amazon will be coming into in Arlington County is in an area where it's relatively urban. And so we do have a somewhat lower homeownership rate in that area. So that's the backdrop around which to think about this. As Jeanette mentioned, a lot of the Amazon incoming workers will be homeowners, but it's already a market that's somewhat challenging to get into as a homeowner. We are a real estate listing and information website at Realtor.com. So we have the benefit of seeing listings from across the country, from multiple listing services across the country, but we also see shopping traffic. So that gives us some unique information, and we can combine those two views to get some interesting insights. These are our listing price trends, and what we can see is that listing prices have moved higher this fall in a variety of counties across the region. Typically on the order of mid to low single digits. Alexandria is moving a little bit higher on listing prices. And at the same time, sales prices have also moved higher. So listing prices don't always trend in exactly the same direction as sales prices, so it's important to look at both. But on the sales price side, we see a range of 0 to 6% if we look at the average pace of growth over the last 12 months. So very healthy real estate market on the price side of things. Of course, if we look at the age of inventory, we start to see something a little bit more interesting. So when we say age of inventory, I'm typically talking about days on market, so the length of time that a property sits on the market for sale before a buyer comes in and buys it. And what we see here is similar to what we've seen in the vast majority of the country, that days on market are declining. So properties are selling faster now than they did 1 year ago, and that's a trend that's been fairly consistently true across the last year, and true across a variety of areas in the region. That suggests that the amount of inventory that we have relative to the number of buyers that are in the market is not enough. And so properties are selling faster because there's a sense of urgency that people need to snap up a listing as soon as it becomes available, or someone else might get in and buy it first. At the same time, even though there's a lot of pressure to snap up available inventory, the number of transactions is a bit mixed. So some counties in the region have been doing better, have seen sales increases, whereas other counties have seen a bit of sales softening in the last year. So the performance there really depends on where you are. So that's the backdrop that we're looking at. Limited inventory, fast-moving home sales, rising prices. How does the typical Amazon worker fit into this backdrop? Well, first let's start with the actual listing price level. So the highest listing price we see at the median is in Arlington County at $640,000. And if we compare that across the region, we can go all the way down to Prince George's County, Maryland, where the typical listing is just over $300,000. So depending on the area that you're choosing to live, between $300,000 and $640,000 is typical. That means, of course, in each of these areas, half of homes are priced above that, half of homes are priced below that. But it gives you an idea of what's available on the market at various price points. The average wage Amazon worker, now obviously there's a distribution, but looking at the average wage worker is set to make $150,000. What might their capability look like as far as how much home they can afford? If you assume a standard 36% of income, that gives them $4,500 a month to spend on housing, depending on the assumption you make for taxes and insurance, which vary, of course, by the jurisdiction that you're looking at, and depending on what you assume for mortgage rates, if they look like they do now, or if they look like they might in the years ahead, you're looking at a range of prices that is affordable to the typical Amazon worker between $750,000 and just over $800,000. So in every jurisdiction that we're looking at, the typical Amazon worker or the average Amazon worker is going to be in that above median income housing situation. So that's good news for this area because inventories have been tightest and fastest moving in the entry-level, very affordable properties. There's a little bit more availability at the higher end, so that's one way that Amazon won't contribute additionally to some of the housing difficulties that we see in this area. Now, studying Seattle, we took a look at what happened in Seattle around expansions and the growth of the Amazon headquarters there. Now, obviously, the Seattle market is very different than the Washington, D.C. market, but it can be instructive as far as the relative pace of growth in properties very near the Amazon headquarters versus the surrounding county. So we studied the expansions in two phases, Towers 1 and 2, and then the construction of Spheres, which began in 2015. And what we found is that around these expansions, in the immediate year following the expansion, prices within 1 mile of the campus increased at 2 to 4 times the pace that we saw in the surrounding county. So there's definitely a local effect, a local Amazon bump in the pace of home price increases. But of course, that can occur due to other factors that are going on there and is surprisingly not sustained in that most immediate area the most over time. We saw that the biggest sustained price increases over time actually happened in a radius between 1 to 5 miles in the surrounding area. So there are immediate benefits in the 1 mile radius around the headquarters, and then those benefits are dispersed in the 2 to 5 mile radius around the headquarters over the following 10 years. Of course, this was a time when the market was growing in general, so all across King County that we studied, we saw prices increase in the time that Amazon was expanding. So what do we see now? As I mentioned, we've already seen the announcement of Amazon coming to town impact real estate in this area. We took a look at property views in the Arlington, Virginia area, and we saw a huge spike immediately following the announcement. We have seen that traffic to Arlington properties actually decline since then from that very high level, and it's roughly back to normal. It's slightly elevated, but roughly back to normal in the past few months. I think that goes to show that the impact of Amazon creates a lot of buzz, but that attention will eventually normalize much in the way that Jeanette suggested, and it's going to be spread over time, over a very long period of time. So that's something that we'll watch going forward to see if that traffic picks up as the Amazon workers actually begin to come into the area. Another interesting finding looking at our listings, so listings are already taking advantage of the fact that Amazon is coming to town and positioning themselves in relation to this brand new employer. So if you look at the number of listings that mention either National Landing, which is a neighborhood that probably many of us weren't very familiar with before the announcement of Amazon, or the term Amazon, or some combination of those terms, you can find these listing terms as far away as Montgomery County or as far out as Fairfax and Prince William counties. So people are already watching and positioning around Amazon, and that's only likely to increase as we get closer to the time when Amazon is really ramping up hiring. So that's just a very high-level overview. We have several presenters tonight, and I look forward to the questions that you have in the question and answer session. So thank you.
Okay, now we'll quickly pivot to new house development and new home sales. And to give us the impact of Amazon on that market segment is Ben Sage, Director for the Mid-Atlantic region of metrostudy.
Thank you, Eric. metrostudy, if you're not familiar, is a new home research and consulting service that has offices around the country. We were established in the 1970s, and we opened up here in the early 2000s. Our clients consist of home builders, developers, banks, utilities, pretty much anybody that cares where growth goes. We track all new home activity in subdivisions, new home subdivisions specifically. We don't track the for rent market, though we do have quite a few apartments in our futures tracking database. Once we find out if it's for rent, then we'll not track it anymore. So we do specialize on the new home for sale, particularly new home subdivisions. So, and the part of our, I mentioned our futures, but also we look at the current land availability as far as developed lots on the ground. So we have a unique insight into the supply side when it comes to home building. And one thing in getting ready for this, I don't know why, that's not our logo, but it's really a full circle, so forgive me for the lost in translation there. Now I totally lost my train of thought. Supply side I was talking about. So the being able to plug into the supply side, I think will help us. And when you think about the impact of Amazon HQ2 1/2 is on the supply side, you know, I think anybody in this room would know that as far as new land availability within several miles of National Landing is going to be very limited. So whatever, a lot of the new that could occur would almost have to be certainly attached, and even more likely really attached, in other words, mid to high-rise type of development. So I'll tell you why I get to that. But I leaned heavily on Jeanette's overview that we started the evening with. And so I just summarized the key points that I pulled out. And so yell, Jeanette, if I'm wrong on any of these, but almost 70,000 potential jobs total, Amazon and Amazon-related jobs over a 16-year period. So I also went with the max. Homeowner households created would be $5,000 according to the GMU estimates. And then looking at single-family, preferences for housing. 66% single-family detached based on, probably based on their incomes more than anything. 26% single-family attached, 8% multifamily for sale, straight from GMU. And I told Jeanette earlier, because I didn't meet her until today, and I said, I hope you don't mind that I depended on your research to kind of draw conclusions on my part of the presentation. She was appreciative, but I also noted that, I looked at it and I tried to poke holes in it, and not having the models available to me, it looked very reasonable, and so I've fully endorse what I've seen so far. And so what I did, though, on my part of the presentation was I put in metrostudy land and supply side information to help with my presentation. So before I talk about that, I just want to summarize real quick the new home environment in DC Metro right now, because DC Metro is generating about 15,000 new home for sale starts per year. And before the Great Recession, DC Metro would have easily done 23, 24, 25, 26,000 units a year. So we're operating well below an historical norm even before the boom. And if you look nationally, we're at about 850,000 for sale permits per year. Before the boom, we would have done 1.2 million. So new home construction, generally speaking, is much lower than what it used to be. But if you look at builder sentiment, it's about as high as it was pre-boom. So builders seem to accept now that whatever level of activity we're at, which to me is low and suppressed, it's been around for so long that they have accepted that as normal. Right now, builders are dealing with, and this is really, what's happening here is almost true around the country, though there are some hot markets. DC is not. DC, in my mind, has underperformed compared to Atlanta, Nashville, Seattle, Denver, some of the hotter markets around the country. But builders around the country are dealing with similar things. They want to be in the more strategic locations as opposed to further out in the suburbs. They are paying more and more for land. Labor was an issue in some of the faster growing markets. It had not been here until recently. So now labor is an issue. Rising costs are an issue everywhere. And so therefore, margins are getting squeezed because as builders pour resources into the closer in communities, the more strategic locations for new home construction, then that's getting more expensive. It's driving up land prices, and we're seeing a widening spread between your typical resale home and your typical new home. So that is the environment of the new home building industry right now. When I looked at the potential demand and how would we be able to accommodate that, that demand, to me, there's only enough supply in the region to accommodate, best guess, and I'm not going to give anybody this presentation because I'd only got Jeanette's presentation right before the weekend, and so I was just putting numbers, looking at our supply, trying to plug it in as best as I can. It needs to be thoroughly gone over. So come away with principles, not specific numbers. I'm throwing out 30% of single-family detached demand. There's going to be more. That's obviously, not enough. There's going to be more pressure on the resale side to supply that, and we're already in an environment where we're undersupplied on the resale side. There's only enough supply to accommodate 20% of created demand in Fairfax County. So that will be, new homes will not be a solution as far as accommodating the added demand. Fairfax is going to struggle to be a solution for that. Again, lack of supply. Though there is enough to accommodate 70% of the single-family attached townhome demand by my read. So we're in better shape there, and we could probably accommodate all of the for sale demand because of the multifamily that's already in place. Probably most of it had been planned for rentals. I suspect we'll see a few become for sale that might have been planned for rentals. Maybe a few more will be for sale than otherwise might have been. So anyway, now keep in mind that new approvals, we're generally dealing in if you compare DC to Houston, to California, wherever, DC is going to be on the more regulatory side of getting something approved. And so if it became easier to get some things approved, then it could provide some relief and some more supply. I know there's advantages and disadvantages to that. I'm not taking a stance here, but I'm just saying regulatory environment could affect this analysis. So I started with Alexandria City, and this is as far as new home construction activity, and I'm not talking about tear downs, I'm talking about new subdivisions. To me, a tear down is very relevant, but it's a net zero in terms of household gain. So I concentrated on new subdivisions. There's really minimal new home subdivision activity because of a lack of land, less than 100 units a year. It's mostly townhomes, but there are some condos. Average closing price, $950,000 in Alexandria. And if you look at the future pipeline, we're not tracking any single-family detached projects. We're only tracking 7 townhome projects, 452 units total. And we don't even know that these will all get final approval. That's just what is going through the approval process. Though there are a few thousand, mostly condos and apartments. And so what I did was, the darker blue is the historical closings, new home closings in new home subdivisions, and then I projected out. And so part of my projections would be that we're going to, it seems more likely than not, let's say, that we'll encounter some sort of recession within the next 3 years. And then, in my mind, not only mine, but also other economists, Annabon Basu was talking about new home. The new home market's going to come back with a vengeance because we've created so many renter households. Plus, the demographics seem to point more towards, instead of the last decade was more growth in renter households nationally, the next cycle will probably be much stronger growth in the for sale side. And so, but I don't really want you to focus on I wish I'd kind of in hindsight done this as a percent, because you guys probably will think, wow, look at that forecast. Are we going to do 20,000 units in the metro area? It's not even the whole metro area. It doesn't include Frederick County, Maryland. I think that's a possible scenario if we have the supply to do it, and that is a big if. But I really want you to look at just the red line, because that's going to be the with Amazon, or the added demand created by Amazon. And so I'm kind of starting with the areas that to me were more impacted, or I think will be more impacted than others. So Alexandria City, and that's about, as far as the blues would have been what happened without Amazon, the red would be, with that. And so that's another 20%, and that's going to be 2/3 of that, in my mind, would probably be multifamily for sale, no single family probably, and the rest would be townhomes possibly. Impact could be larger if there was, given that there's more supply here compared to Arlington. According to our research, and Jeanette, I think your research indicated probably a bigger impact in Arlington as far as added households. But, and I can believe the demand would be true there. The supply, though, seems to be more limited in Arlington. So that's what we're having to balance out there. If we look at Arlington County, again, less than 100 units a year, all attached, mostly condo, average closing price, very high, $850,000. Future pipeline, again, no single family, only 4 townhome projects totaling 100 units, so that's a couple hundred units less than in Alexandria. There are a few thousand multifamily projects that we're tracking. The scale is different here, but the forecast is not too different really from Alexandria. But again, you see here about a 15% bump in new home activity over a 16-year period. By the way, I didn't really try to estimate demand on a per year basis. I just divided it by 16 and just evenly distributed it, and just to get a feel for the impact. Fairfax County, just less than, just for single family detached, only 200 units a year, over $1 million average closing price. If you included the tear downs, the customs, that would go up over $1.5 million, I would imagine. We're doing about 300 to 400 new townhome units a year, 730,000 average closing price, 250 or so condo units a year. That's mostly stacked flats as opposed to 2-over-2s or back-to-backs, $500,000 average closing price. And you can see the future pipeline, 37 single-family projects, but they average only 12 units each. Your average, your next single-family detached community is going to be, on average, only 12 units. In the past, big builders wouldn't even touch that. Now we're seeing even big builders are so desperate to be closer in. Any builder of any size would be interested in something like that. There are a few thousand townhome lots and then several thousand multifamily in the pipeline. And so Fairfax, if the supply can be there, again, you see some impact here. I'm sorry, I said 15% it's 15% for Fairfax County. I think it's more like 20% for Arlington, 25% for Alexandria. Prince William County, and again, I'm just highlighting the ones that would appear to be would be most affected by Amazon. This is a larger market. It's about 1,500 units a year, if that math adds up correctly. A little less than that, it looks like. 650 would be detached, nearly as many townhomes, and then less than 200 a year would be condos. And those condos are going to be mostly 2-over-2s or back-to-backs, something that kind of mimics a townhome lifestyle. But the future pipeline is more extensive here, not nearly as many multifamily but you can see more than twice as many single-family lots as townhome lots. So now you're starting to see where the where the single-family relief can maybe start to occur on the new home side is going to be more so in Loudoun and Prince William, less so in Fairfax, Arlington, Alexandria. Speaking of Prince William, you can see now the red is getting smaller and smaller just because, first of all, Prince William is more active, but also the percentage is not as large in terms of its impact on the new home community. Now, these areas are not as impacted, even though Loudoun is easily the most active new home community, county for new home community. But the with or without Amazon, there's an impact. It's really that red in terms of absolute numbers is only a little bit less than Prince William County, but it's a much smaller percent in terms of overall activity. You know, if you look at the commute from Loudoun to National Landing, if you take the train, you have to go, if I'm not mistaken, because I'm a suburbanite, you have to go into DC and then take the other line back out. And so it's not as quick a commute as it would be from the southwest side of northern Virginia. So that's Loudoun County. The district is, the number is so small here for the with Amazon just because there's just no supply in the district. Really only condo properties would be able to accommodate that. Again, it'll be up to the resale stock to accommodate any added increase on the single family side. Again, Prince George's County will be an active county going forward. There's a little more room to grow there, but its impact of Amazon, again, less so as a percentage. Same with Montgomery County. And so I even included Stafford. So these geographies mimic what Jeanette put in her. So she combined, I think appropriately, Stafford County and Fredericksburg. So that's why I combined them here, and she's combined Spotsylvania, King George, and Caroline as I did. Because I know you guys couldn't wait to hear what I had to say about Spotsylvania, King George, and Caroline County. So final thoughts. The distribution, again, I'm pointing back to this distribution from the GMU report, and it's that 66%. I agree. At that price, at that income range, that will be the demand. That'll be what your typical, I think, Amazon householder will want, but it's going to be the part that the new home will most struggle to provide. I did talk to my counterpart in Seattle. I just said, what do I need to know about Amazon coming here? And there could still be differences, absolutely. But he just said, you know, the single employee at Amazon will want to live close to the office. Single buyers will get an extra room to let. Family buyers don't need to be as close, obviously. One thing I forgot here is that he said they will flock to the best school districts. So, you know, you think about Arlington and Fairfax and Montgomery and Loudoun, some of the best districts in the country. They will flock to those. And so that's why I think it's appropriate to see some impact outside Arlington, Alexandria, Fairfax, because there are some very competitive schools in the area. So there will be an impact on the new home market, obviously. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be here. But I think there's a possibility of overreaction and over-speculation, kind of similar to the thesis at the beginning of the presentations tonight, is that this is going to be spread out over 16 years. The ability of the new home side to supply this, the land valuations are going to go higher. It's going to be more expensive, and you know, at $150,000 only goes so far. So you're looking at the need for dual income households or whatever in order to be able to afford. So there will be an impact, but as far as what I'm communicating to my clients is don't overreact, react in a calculated manner, because this is going to be spread out. Earlier in the evening, I think somebody talked about this evolving, and I think that's going to be how it plays out. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. So we will now pivot to rental housing. Our next speaker is Sandy Paul. He's the Senior Managing Director for National Research at Newmark Knight Frank, and he will talk about the impact of Amazon's workers on apartment rental demand and supply.
Good evening. It's exciting to be here. There's been so much to talk about. I've really enjoyed the presentations that we've heard so far, not only because they have been so chock full of information, but I think because they've really provided the proper context for HQ2 or HQ2.5, 1.5. On that, we have to work on the nomenclature. But I think it's really been valuable to understand that this was a big win, an economic development win for the region and certainly for Arlington. It's certainly going to have a material impact on our commercial real estate market and the multifamily market in particular. But when you take it in context of the entire region or of all of Northern Virginia, I think it is something that is easily absorbed. That's not to say there will not be some challenges. Certainly, the school districts that are bursting at the seams and the roadways and metro, those are all possible challenges that are going to be presented to us. But I think when you look at a region that has 43,000 new jobs a year added on average, this is something that we can handle. So I've been asked to talk about multifamily supply-demand market fundamentals, and why don't we take a look at some of those statistics. So again, I think it's important that we start with job growth, and not just the overall quantity of new jobs as far as where the region stands today, but also specific types of jobs. Now, a lot of Amazon's new positions are going to be in that all-important professional and business services sector. Why do I think it's all important? Well, these are typically the jobs that are most prone to leasing Class A apartments and that are very office-intensive as well for those of you who are in that business. So 60,700 new jobs created across the Washington region in the last 12 months. And what share of that is in this professional and business services sector? Well, as you can see, last year it was about 20%. This year it's been about 33%. So we're already starting from a rather strong and growing base in this all-important segment of the market. Now, let's take a look at the forecast for supply-demand for the multifamily market regionally. Now, what you're seeing here is pre-Amazon. Okay, so this is as of the third quarter, the forecast that we at Newmark Knight Frank had developed in terms of market rate units. And you can see how it's broken out, the metro area on the right, Northern Virginia, and then the scale makes it a little bit challenging, but Arlington, and then of course the Pentagon City, Crystal City submarket. And what you see is that when you look at net demand in blue, the pipeline of what's under construction in the orange, and then the planned and may deliver in the yellow, you see that an occupancy rate was very likely to decline, right? We have been seeing a significant number of deliveries in the multifamily market over the past 2 to 3 years. There have been more that are planned for the next 12 to 24 months, and so we were looking at an occupancy rate decline. Now, post-HQ2 decision, this is our new forecast. What has changed in terms of projected demand and deliveries? Well, it's important to see, of course, that think of this as concentric circles, right? So the smaller the submarket or the jurisdiction, Pentagon City, Crystal City, is going to have the biggest impact when you change the forecast. And you can see again that the net demand and what is likely to deliver over the next 3 years through third quarter of 2021 is probably going to be in balance in Pentagon City, Crystal City. And when you put that together in terms of an occupancy rate, what you see is actually the occupancy rate is likely to begin to edge up slightly over the next 3 years. Now, again, the concentric circles, as you expand out to Arlington, there is an impact, it's material, but it's less of an impact. And then, of course, the wider you go, the less impact there is. I think it was very interesting. When we ran these numbers, we found that at the metro level, the rate was unchanged, right? Meaning that, again, the number of jobs that Amazon is likely to create and the amount of multifamily rental demand that it is likely to bring, at the size of our market, as you heard from Jeanette and from our other speakers, this is something that we are well prepared to absorb. What does all this mean for rent growth? Well, this is a look at effective rent growth in the multi-housing market going back to 2010. Regionally, our rental rate growth has been 2.1% over that period. And again, you can see how it's broken out in terms of the metro area in blue here, Northern Virginia in white, Arlington and Orange, and then the Pentagon City, Crystal City area. I've got to start using that national landing term, don't I? That submarket in yellow. And so what are we expecting going forward? Well, we're looking at about a 3-year metro projected average of about 1.4% per year. Maybe that surprises you. Maybe you think that that is relatively modest. I think it's important to again remember the context. As Ben mentioned, we are likely to see a national recession sometime in the next 3 years. That's certainly the consensus of economists. Probably late 2019, early 2020, that's the consensus. I would agree with that. And that at the same time, we've also have a significant amount of pre-existing delivered product that's likely to arrive over the next 12 to 24 months, which will keep rent growth down. At the same time, look at where Pentagon City, Crystal City was in 2018 and where we're expecting it to move to in 2019. That's between a 200 to 300 basis point increase over that time. So it all depends on context. Now, for those of you who may have been at our benchmarks event on November 14th of this year, you have seen this slide. And this was pre-Amazon. Now, this is a lot of words for one slide. I don't expect you to read it all. I really want you to focus on the colors on the slide. So the Virginia apartment submarkets are in orange, the district in blue, and suburban Maryland in that yellow color. And we have not yet updated this in light of Amazon's decision. But what I think is so interesting is that a lot of the submarkets immediately around National Landing were on the right side of the slide, meaning that they had weaker rent growth potential over the next 2 years compared to the ones on the left. Now, again, this is relative. The submarkets on the right are not necessarily going to see rent declines, and we're not going to necessarily see them before HQ2. But I think there is the potential for a lot of those circled submarkets on the right to begin migrating toward the left over the next couple of years. I think it's important to review the types of multi-housing projects that we are likely to see at National Landing. Here are some of the selected projects that have approvals. What I think is so interesting is you see a relatively wide range of unit count among these different projects. You know, everything from about 250 units on up to about 750 units. And I'm a proud Arlington resident. I've been a resident here for 18 years. I can tell you that I am pretty sure that Arlington is going to do what it can in order to facilitate the approval of more multi-housing in order to accommodate the new job growth. But again, when you think about the chart that you saw earlier, with the annual gains in jobs due to Amazon over the next 16 years, at no time between now and 2030 was there an annual calendar year gain of more than 3,000 jobs. So in a market with 3.2 million positions and with an annual gain of 43,000 jobs, this is relatively easily absorbed by our commercial real estate market. Who lives in National Landing today? Well, here are some current statistics. You know, we've defined the area as Amazon has, about 14,000 people, a robust household income of $138,000. Renters currently make up about 72% of the population in that area. And we know from history, and you've seen it tonight, that Amazon does typically expect a lot of, yes, millennials to take the available positions that they will be bringing to National Landing. So I do think we will see robust multi-housing demand. About 53% of the population in National Landing already has obtained a graduate or professional degree. I found that quite remarkable, and certainly I think we can expect many more well-educated people to be arriving. Basically, you know, the takeaway from this slide is that the new hires will accelerate what is already a rather sturdy rental market, and one that has largely recovered from sequestration. I'm sure you remember that Crystal City in particular was relatively hard hit by BRAC and by federal budget austerity measures. Now, this is a market that has been recovering and will see further acceleration due to HQ2. All of that notwithstanding, I don't think that the job growth is the most important thing that we can take away from HQ2. Yes, there will be new jobs. Yes, there will be demand for multi-housing in the short to intermediate term. But I think the most important takeaway is the long-term implications of the investment that we're going to be making in our workforce. We are a region that has a lot of fantastic universities, but that has not focused on computer sciences graduates quite as much as some of the competitors that we meet up with when we're trying to attract projects like this. The Carnegie Mellons of Pittsburgh and the Stanfords and Berkeleys in California. This was a hole in the donut of what is otherwise an outstanding region for education. And now we're filling it. George Mason is making a $250 million commitment. Virginia Tech, a $1 billion commitment. These are decisions and investments that are being supported by the Commonwealth, supported by Arlington. When you think about the long-term prospects for generating multi-housing demand in the region, a lot of that is going to come from the graduates of these programs who will not just be taking jobs at Amazon, but will be taking jobs at the government contractors who are losing employees to Amazon and need to fill those jobs. They will be creating startups of their own over the next 5, 10, 15 years and beyond. And so the long-term implications, I think, are actually more important, more valuable than the near-term job creation. There's also the branding value of symbolism and what that means for our regional economy and our apartment market. Economic development wins beget more economic development wins, right? We saw this locally here in Arlington with Nestle and the buzz that that created. And so Amazon is taking that to a whole new level. Any company, tech or otherwise, that did not already have Northern Virginia on its list of places to consider for expanding operations probably has it on their list now. Those are my remarks for now. I look forward to taking your questions in a few moments. Thanks very much.
So now we'll pivot to the impact of Amazon on apartment investment and ownership. To brief us on that, we have Christian Barrero of the Zupancic Group of Marcus and Millichap.
Thank you, Eric. I appreciate that. This is only the second largest crowd I've ever been in front of in George Mason. My freshman year of college, we lost to George Mason in the NCAA men's soccer tournament. Very harsh crowd. I hope you guys and gals aren't as harsh as they were. I would say our presentation today is very conceptual. We're brokers. We're multifamily advisors. We learn through experience. The Zupancic Group of Marcus and Millichap is run by Marty Zupancic. Unfortunately, Marty couldn't be here with us. He's actually at my wedding in Columbia, so I'll be joining him down there Saturday. But I guess I'll do. Who we are? We currently have a $200 million pipeline of investment sales, specifically multifamily and multifamily development. We're working on deals in Tyson's Corner, Arlington County, in the Westover neighborhoods and Penrose neighborhoods, as well as we just closed on a 130-unit in Winchester, Virginia. We don't own properties. We help people, investors, buy and sell them. We have 8 agents on our team, full marketing staff, full operations staff, some of whom are with us right now. How we got here, I'd like to thank Eric, of course, from George Mason and the Northern Virginia Apartment Association, and also NVAR for running this event. Our take on things is very, again, conceptual. Doing deals, that's how we get our experience. As it relates to statistics, I think some of the presenters ahead of us had some great statistics on the comparison with Seattle and how that's going to be similar to Arlington and the surrounding metro area. I'd expect over time gradual rent increases on multifamily buildings. This is a 12 to 16 year approach. It's not going to be a bomb is dropped and then rents double. We already have high rents in the DC metro area. Growth in other income. I expect parking to become more valuable in the immediate vicinity of Amazon HQ2 in National Landing. There are some owners that we work with right now that they don't charge for parking. There isn't that high of a demand for it. But as 25,000 employees and their families flock to an area, we expect parking to become more valuable. Again, slight drop in vacancy rates of multifamily, stronger absorption rates in Class A properties, and then, of course, you know, the million-dollar question, what's going to happen to my property taxes? We expect property taxes to go up, affecting your bottom line as a multifamily owner. And again, as many of the previous presenters said, the greatest effect that we expect is in the National Landing area, and then a diminishing effect as you get further away from that particular area. Two brief case studies. First case study. We listed a portfolio of multifamily properties for sale the day that Amazon announced. All three of them are under contract. They'll be closed by the end of the year. Two of which are out-of-market capital, not local investors. Two of the deals went under contract in the first day. Somebody submitted a full-price offer, no contingencies, and one of which is a cash deal. The third deal is also a cash deal. We expect to see more of this. I'll talk about that a little bit in a couple slides. One of the other case studies I wanted to mention was Uber. This case study really demonstrates the hype effect, the hype wave as we've called it. In 2015, Uber announced that they had purchased a $123 million office building called Uptown Station in Oakland. They were planning to add 2,000 to 3,000 employees in that location. And just with that announcement alone, cap rates of multifamily assets within a 1 mile radius of the location dropped 70 basis points. $10,000 of NOI, that could attribute $200,000 of property value to multifamily investments if it's a 5% rate of return or a 5% cap rate. What ended up happening was Uber did not strategically place employees in that location. They ended up selling that building to CIM Group for a moderate profit, but just the hype alone affected cap rates. It also affected cap rates in Class C properties. As these properties age, cap rates have reduced, and then causing more upside. When there's more upside in a deal, cap rates tend to be lower. Impact on sellers. Again, we expect many sellers to ride the hype wave. I've gotten calls left and right of multifamily owners saying, what's the effect of my property? How should I time the market? Should I sell now? Should I sell in 3 years? Should I sell in 5 years? Really, everybody's situation is different. We always advise clients, well, let's look at your strategy first of all. Are you profit-based? Are you trying to, are you selling if you have to? Is it debt-related? I would always say hype can be very good for sellers because buyers, they want to get into the market. They think nobody else has heard about Amazon coming. The reality is everybody else has. If you wanted to get into the market and hit a home run, it was probably 24 to 36 months ago. You still can get in now because, you know, Amazon hasn't even started deploying employees here. But I would say selling now could potentially be beneficial to owners as we are in a rising interest rate market. Interest rates are roughly 100 basis points, give or take, greater than where they were back in 2017, early Q1. So that's something to keep an eye on. This right here demonstrates the capital migration trends from other regions of the country, just as of third quarter 2018 into Virginia in particular. Just over $250 million. We expect that to go up significantly with Amazon's announcement. As I mentioned in the brief case study, 2 of the 3 properties that we're selling in Northern Virginia right now are out-of-market buyers. We expect to see more of that. I've already gotten calls from agents, investors in Seattle, Cleveland, California, where they've already been through this once before, and they're all very excited to invest in the nation's capital in the metro area. Impact on buyers. Expect to pay higher prices. That's what's going to happen. DC, it's already a very, very pricey investment market for multifamily properties. I can't remember the last time we sold a multifamily asset for greater than a 6 cap. The past 5 deals that our team has sold have been, off the top of my head, 4.5 cap, 4 3/4 cap, 3 3/4 cap, 4 cap, and 4.5 cap. So low cap rates, it's very common. Increasing the bid-ask gap. As sellers want to ride this hype wave, we expect there to be sellers trying to reach for the stars, and buyers, they want to meet them there, but there's going to be an increase in that gap because rates returns are going to be dependent on interest rates. With those rising, that's going to be an effect. If you're a cash buyer, we don't know many cash buyers that are looking to park cash for 2% rates of return. I wish we'd be doing a lot more business. Lower leverage yields, as I mentioned, we expect more of that, more equity necessary to get into a deal. For instance, the 3 properties we're selling right now, they would pencil out around 60% LTV. Many people want to put as little money down as possible, 75, 80 LTV. You'd have negative cash flow in these deals if that were the case. So we expect higher capital outputs in order to make deals work. Multifamily investment strategies in particular. I think one of the panelists already said this before. We expect an increase in condo conversions. Condo conversions are very much prevalent in DC. We haven't seen it as much in Northern Virginia on a private capital stage, but as home ownership will increase, we expect there to be more condo conversions which should be profitable for owners. Increase in adaptive reuses. There are a number of office buildings that have become obsolete, especially in the Crystal City area. We expect more conversions to multifamily, and we expect more multifamily development and mixed-use development as well. Secondary markets, if you're chasing yield, the meager yield you might get from this area, it would be in secondary markets. It's not going to be Northern Virginia, Arlington County. You're going to be looking at your Fauquier counties, your Prince William counties, your Prince George's counties, which we've already seen are going to have minimal immediate impacts from HQ2, but that would be where you're going to have your best chance of getting the best yield. Michelle is going to speak on affordable housing and the impact there. We were able to speak in October at the Northern Virginia Apartment Association annual meeting about the Housing Conservation District that Arlington County imposed back in December 2017. That's something that was created to try to incentivize owners of apartment buildings in the county to preserve affordable housing. Arlington County's lost over 17,000 market rate affordable units since the early 2000s. Amazon's announcement only looks like it's going to exacerbate the problem even further. And then finally, joint ventures. There are some owners that will say, I don't want to sell. I just want to ride this wave. I want to be an owner. I don't want to deal with the tax consequences, whatever it might be. We're likely to see more joint ventures, especially multifamily properties. Joint venturing with an able operator, an able manager that can become part of the partnership, renovate a property, develop a property to make it more profitable than it currently is. Finally, my recommendations for multifamily owners, investors, definitely seek advisory and brokerage services. We've seen so many times principal to principal, obviously we're tooting our own horn, but we've seen so many times where it's principal to principal where with a economic driver like Amazon HQ2, exposure is key, especially if you're a seller and you want to sell for the highest price. Exposing to the widest reach possible. We're a national publicly traded firm, 90 plus offices. It's important to get maximum exposure. If we put a building on the market for sale, the buyer might be out of Seattle. And if somebody calls you and says, I want to buy your property, and I'm local, that's great, but you want to make investors compete because that's going to get the highest price, going to leave the most amount of money in an owner's pocket. Obviously, that buyers don't want to hear that. Buyers want to get it for the least amount possible. But we've got to play both sides because we represent buyers and sellers. Sellers should consider 1031 exchanges with a trending downwards cap rate effect that we expect. I don't think it's going to be drastic, but there's going to be an arbitrage. If you're an owner and you want to sell, or you can sell for a 4.5 cap, a 4 3/4 cap rate, and you can 1031 exchange and not deal with the capital gains exposure into a passive asset such as a CVS, Walgreens, any triple net lease property, they could be trading for 5, 5 1/4, 5.5 cap, depending on where you're purchasing. There's an opportunity there. You can be making passive income and more income at that. Finally, keep informed on debt markets. It is a rising interest rate environment, so I'd always say make sure you have multiple lending relationships. So if you're going to be buying a multifamily investment property, you're dialed in on what it's actually going to take out of your pocket, what's the equity requirement to make a deal work. That is all I've got for today. Look forward to hearing some questions in the panel.
And for our final presentation, but definitely in my opinion, the most important one in our panel, is we're going to talk about the impact of Amazon on the affordability issues in our area, and as well as what should be done about housing policy in our various jurisdictions. Michelle Winters will be presenting on this. She's the Executive Director for the Alliance for Housing Solutions.
Great, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. So as Eric said, my name is Michelle Winters. I work with the Alliance for Housing Solutions, and we are a nonprofit organization in Arlington, Virginia, that is seeking to increase the supply of affordable housing, both in Arlington and in Northern Virginia. We run, among many of the things that we do, we run a campaign called Arlington for Everyone, which is really a campaign that allows people to express their support for housing affordability and housing options and variety in Arlington, and the diversity that allows Arlington to keep and create. So I'm going to talk really 3 main points. First of all, I want to express what others have expressed, which is that Amazon does bring many opportunities for the region. It's a very exciting announcement. In Arlington, we've had, and nobody's mentioned this, we had a 20% vacancy, a commercial vacancy rate for years. So Amazon coming helps fill that. It helps solve a lot of budget problems that the county has been having as a result of that vacancy. The second thing I'm going to talk about, and you've heard this a little bit, but we have a housing affordability problem regardless of Amazon. We've heard a lot of, well, you know, it's going to affect things, it's not going to affect things. Well, we've already had a housing affordability problem. And so I'll talk about what some of the possible solutions and some potential new opportunities that are created. But before I do all of that, when you're talking about housing affordability, it's always really important to set the stage with what does that mean. Housing is affordable, generally defined by HUD and all the official definitions, if you can pay 30% or less of your gross income for your rent or your mortgage and other housing costs. So that's the affordability concept. It applies to anybody. But the people that it means the most to are the people with lower incomes, who are left with less after they pay for that housing. And so when we're talking about affordable housing, we tend to be talking about housing that is affordable to people earning maybe 60% of the median income or less. And those are the people that government programs for affordable housing tend to focus on as well. And why is that important? Obviously, housing affordability is something that helps drive economic success, attracting big job engines like Amazon. But housing affordability also matters a lot for the nuts and bolts of a community, and some perhaps much more meaningful for those nuts and bolts. So nurses, firefighters, teachers, daycare workers, all of those people have to help those people who work for Amazon exist. And those people need a place to live as well. And then housing affordability is tied to all of these other really important things in a community: diversity, health and well-being, environmental impact. And we talk about sprawl versus close-in development. That's a huge, huge impact. Community and school, educational stability. All of these things really matter. So if you care about those things, you really care about housing affordability. So he stole my thunder. All the other speakers had data, so I was only going to show you one slide, and he already mentioned the 17,000 units that we lost. But the blue chart on the left shows you what has happened for rental housing affordability in Arlington. That is a graph of the number of affordable units in Arlington that were affordable to people earning 60% of the area median income or less. So back in 2000, it was close to 20,000 units. And in the most recent data, it actually popped up a little bit to around 3,000 units. And that housing conservation district that Christian mentioned is essentially trying to draw a line around that last few thousand units and saying, please help us hold on, or please help us replace them. But that's the past, okay? Now, what about looking forward? So the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments just released a report in September saying that we actually have, looking forward for the next 25 and more years, we actually have a huge housing shortfall that we're expecting just based on what kinds of development we're planning to do. So they looked at the amount of job growth that we're expecting through 2045, and they talked to all the jurisdictions, and they found out how much new housing we're planning to create during that time. And there's a gap out there's a gap now, and starting as soon as 2020, the gap is 49,000. Going out to 2045, the gap grows to 115,000. That is fewer housing units than we need to meet the job growth projections out to 2045. So this is all to point out that we already have a housing affordability problem and an affordable housing problem in our area. And so the question is, then what do we do about it? And what does Amazon have to do with any of that? So the two main things I want to talk about today about housing affordability, about the drivers of housing, are on the supply side and the dollar side. So the supply side being basically the basic building blocks of affordability. We need to have enough supply to meet the demand in order to have a functioning, well-operating housing market. If you don't have enough supply for demand, your costs go up, affordability suffers. So we need, I'm a supporter of affordable housing, but I support all kinds of housing supply, whether it's affordable officially or not. And then we also have to talk about dollars, because when you talk about affordable housing specifically for those lower income people, that type of housing needs dollars in order to make it affordable. That doesn't happen naturally. So that we need to talk about both general supply and dollars. So, at the risk of greatly simplifying how to create housing supply, I carved things up into three different categories in terms of what we need to do. Now, there's one that's not on here, which is sprawl out into West Virginia and Pennsylvania. I'm presuming that that is not going to be the solution, because that had been what we had done over the past several decades. We just continued to grow out and out and out. We've gotten fairly far along in that end, and we actually need to start taking a look at our existing developed areas and looking at them and what we can do to our existing developed areas, not just within the Beltway, but the whole region, and what can we do in those areas to help increase housing supply. So adding to the availability of lots through redevelopment potential. So the three areas that I wanted to talk about on the supply side are density in transit and activity centers, missing middle, and accessory dwellings. So starting with density in transit and activity centers. This is the Roslyn-Ballston corridor in Arlington. This is what we've been doing, and we've been very good at doing this. The Jefferson Davis, hopefully renamed, other corridor for the metro, and we're starting to do this out along the new Metro Silver Line. We're starting to do this in other areas. The whole region needs to take another look at what density and activity centers we have established and what more we can do to find them and establish them and grow them so that we can fit density into those areas in a way that is transit-oriented and smart and compact. And the Council of Governments, one of the outcomes of that study that showed that there was a 100,000 unit gap, resulted in them doing work to try to figure out how they can fill that gap and where they can fill in those activity centers. But that's not all that we need to do in those areas. We've been talking a lot about something that a lot of people have called missing middle housing. And that's a confusing term. Some people think it just means middle income housing, but what I mean in this case for missing middle is the kind of housing that you need to have some zoning reforms in order to achieve. So the kind of housing that is really kind of outlawed in a world where only single-family housing, townhomes, and multifamily and large multifamily buildings are allowed. The missing middle is the space in between that we used to be able to build before a lot of the zoning came along, and you see it in a lot of older communities. It's the kind of thing that creates village centers that you can build along corridors as transitions between some of the higher density areas and some of the lower density areas. So I mean things from duplexes to fourplexes, eightplexes, those kind of things. Mid-scale housing that kind of looks like single family. You can see that one house there. That's a fourplex unit in Norfolk, Virginia. This is really exciting. It's getting a lot of buzz all around the country. Minneapolis, actually, just last week, you might have heard this, on Friday, their city council agreed to allow triplex development throughout the entire city of Minneapolis, so no longer limiting to only single-family homes in Minneapolis. This is path-breaking. We need to do more along those lines, and I'm not talking about just Arlington, all around the region people are talking about this. And another example of that locally, by the way, is something that we just went on a tour of last week with Roderick, was the cottage communities. So Falls Church has a cottage community ordinance. Like I said, we just went on a tour last week. They're not affordable. Like I said, I'm in favor of all kinds of supply, especially if it is the kind of supply that helps bring costs lower than what it could otherwise be. So these cottage homes are selling for $750,000 in a place where probably you would have built a $1.5 to $2 million home. So those are the kinds of things we're talking about as well. And then on the third piece I wanted to mention is sort of within those single-family home areas, we need to try to see how we can evolve those single-family home areas to also help meet the supply challenge. So we've been working in Arlington and lots of other jurisdictions working on accessory dwelling units. So what does this mean? This means granny cottages. This means granny apartments in the basement. In Arlington, we have legalized finally and loosened up the rules for apartments within a home, but we don't yet allow a backyard cottage, for instance. So this is something that we need to work harder on. We're planning over the next year to do more of that. But not just accessory dwellings, we need to work on, simple things like making it easier to share homes. There's actually some regulations that make that difficult right now. And then underlying all of this, you can see I have plan, streamline, reduce costs, increase certainty, and move to YIMBY. So what does all that mean? Basically, all of these things are possible, but they're very hard to do. And so in order to meet our supply challenge in a way that helps meet our affordability challenge, we need to make this process more certain, reduce the costs of it, and we need to plan, and we need to plan more quickly. I'll note that the Falls Church ordinance that created those cottages was created start to finish in 4 months. When was the last time you heard something like that that's new and innovative actually being created and put into place in 4 months? It was an amazing thing I learned last week. And then moving to YIMBY. So what is YIMBY? Well, it's the opposite of NIMBY. Most people say not in my backyard. That's the problem that has created some of these problems with supply. It is really hard to build because people say no. Well, we need people to say yes. And so that's one of the things that AHS, my organization, does, is that we are around to try to help the community understand why they should say yes. And so we need more people and more supporters of that movement in order to fill the supply gap. Now moving on to subsidy and investment dollars. So this is the dollar side. Just to be very clear, an affordable housing project that is officially sort of serving and committed to meeting the needs of a 60% of AMI or below, affordable housing project is 80%, give or take, paid for by standard sources. So that's private loans, Fannie, Freddie, or FHA. It's many times low-income housing tax credit equity investment that comes from private investors. The money that we need on top of that is the more colorful gap there at the top. In Arlington, some of that money comes from county sources. And we have something called the Affordable Housing Investment Fund that uses a variety of inputs to loan money to affordable housing developers to create that affordable housing. And that's what we need some more of. In order to be able to do more of these projects, we need to fill those gaps in those projects more frequently. Right now, we're constantly running low on those funds, and we need to increase the amount of those gap fillers. And those gap fillers can come from occasionally the federal government, but you notice I didn't put them on here because that doesn't happen often. State, VHDA, the Virginia Housing Development Authority, which I think someone is in the room from, has actually committed to adding $15 million a year to the amount of money that they put into affordable housing in Northern Virginia. And that's a very welcome increase. And we're looking forward to finding out what that means. There's going to be a process to figure out what that means. So that's one positive news. The other thing is that Virginia actually has a housing trust fund, but right now it's only funded at $5 million a year for the entire state. And that's a fraction of what Arlington even spends. So we have a campaign that we've signed on to that is looking in this next General Assembly session to increase that to $20 million. Again, that's actually still much smaller than it should be for a state the size of Virginia, but we need to start somewhere. And then locally, I mentioned our Affordable Housing Investment Fund. This is something that the county puts some general dollars into. Money from developers, when they do a large site plan development, feeds into that fund. It's a loan fund, so paybacks from all the other properties that are paying the loans back goes into that fund. And we will be getting money into that fund from Amazon when they start doing those big projects. But that's many years into the future. Right now, they're moving into existing properties, they're renovating, they're not actually going to be building anything new, so that doesn't produce anything from that existing law that requires affordable housing contributions. The tax revenue that they are going to help create will also help, and it'll be there as a potential source for the county to use when they're figuring out how much they're going to allocate to affordable housing. But that's also many, many years off. You saw how slow the buildup is, and that's probably how slow the buildup of the tax revenue is going to be as well. And so we need to try to figure out, given that we have all of these challenges now, but we have a potential revenue source in the future, it would be great if we could figure out how to pull some of that investment and front load some of that investment. The other thing I'll mention is the private side of things, a very exciting new initiative that you may have heard about called the Washington Housing Initiative. It is something that is run by JBG Smith in partnership with the Federal City Council, and they are in the process of creating a new low-interest social investment loan fund for preserving affordable housing in the DC area. And they're looking for investors. And I heard that JBG Smith has an in with Amazon. So I'm hoping that there might be some sort of additional investment in that great new loan fund that will help preserve some affordable housing in the region. And so the bottom line is that the answer to the question of how will Amazon affect affordable housing is that, well, market-wise, it's not going to make things better. But can we turn Amazon coming into an opportunity? And what I mean by that is, can we use their presence and the buzz and the excitement to trigger some of the actions that we've needed to take for a very long time, both on the supply side and on the dollar side, to get the kind of resources that we need to help solve some of our housing affordability challenges, whether that's through people who are so interested in the potential impact that they actually support the political actions and policy changes that need to take place or the developments that need to happen. Or when Amazon comes and they get involved in the local business community, the Federal City Council, the Greater Washington Partnership, all of these business communities, if they show leadership, then they said that they're interested in housing affordability for their entire ecosystem, and they saw what happened in Seattle. Maybe they will be leaders in that space as well. I'll have to mention also Jeff Bezos gave millions of dollars to homelessness organizations just in the last month. And so maybe there's some future possibilities there. So hopefully one of those things will happen, and we will have some movement on housing affordability. Thank you.
Okay, so I invite all of our speakers to come up so we can have a Q&A with the audience for the next 20 minutes or so. If you could please activate their lapel mics. There are 2 mics on either side of the room. If you have a question, please line up on the mic and we will call you. So you can start lining up on the mics if you have a question. All right, we'll start over there.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the presentation. You talked about the jobs that are being created and people moving to this area, millennials, families, children. Are there any stats or is there any trend line based on Amazon's employee base, who these people will be in terms of like the average family size?
So I guess that.
Any way of predicting that?
Is that me? So what I did was I looked at data in the Seattle market and extrapolated based off of what we know about not necessarily Amazon-specific workers, but workers in the Amazon area in specific occupations and industries. And so the distribution skews younger, it's more high-tech, and we have a slightly different average wage because that's what Amazon told us they're going to plan for. So there are, in part of the housing model, there's a large typology of different household structures, and there's not one single one that's necessarily the only one to talk about. So there's a variety and a mix, and I'd be happy to follow up with you later on some of the specifics with that.
Yes, sir.
John Farrell with McCandless and Lillard. I'm curious about Ms. Chapman and the next fellow who was talking. Forgive me, I forgot your name. In looking at your projections of the distribution of the housing that would be generated by these folks, did you take into consideration the fact that we've had a housing moratorium in Fairfax, Loudoun, and Prince William County since 2016, and there's nothing telling us that that's going to change? You can't even get the staff to sit down and talk to you about trying to create more housing. That's part A of that question, but the part B of that question is the large percentage of these jurisdictions where you've got to have an acre or more, 2 acres or more. Last number I saw was 70% of Fairfax requires an acre or more. The numbers are worse in Loudoun, they're worse in Prince William. My intuition is that the distribution we're actually going to see from these folks is not the one that you're showing, but it's going to get skewed into Maryland. And when you skew it into Maryland, now you start asking the people of Botetourt and Louisa County, do they really want to be giving money to Amazon so that the income tax revenue can go to Annapolis? And so I'm just curious about what impact these moratoria are having on your expectations.
I'll go first on this, if that's okay. The forecasts that I did are completely supply agnostic, and it's based on the current distribution of households with jobs in various locations. So the moratorium does affect more the net new supply side of this, and obviously if there isn't housing for these workers to go into, those forecasts won't be accurate. So the reality is then that the workers will have to change their sets of trade-offs, and sometimes that means that they'll change their housing type preference because they don't want to be that far away, and sometimes it means that they will move farther out so that they can get a single family detached that maybe they can't get in Fairfax. And so that's the short answer on the distribution that as I laid it out.
It's an important point, John, and I think that was a theme of my presentation was the lack of supply, but I did mean to mention that, yeah, there is proper reform in Northern Virginia that had an unintended consequence of stifling rezoning applications. And so that came at a time right when it was timely for the development industry to start actually gearing up. We were coming out of a recession, and we had kind of absorbed all the excess pretty quickly, actually, because we weren't that overdeveloped on the residential for sale side. And so right when it's time to gear up and ramp up, this proper reform hits, the unintended consequences, which stifled rezoning. So that has just exacerbated a supply problem. And I think it may, for the time being, lead to consumers choosing a lifestyle in a more dense neighborhood than they might otherwise have chosen. Michelle mentioned about growth going to Pennsylvania and West Virginia, and that has happened. It has happened in the past, and the 40% or 45% of all housing activity is outside the traditional Northern Virginia of Loudoun, Fairfax, Arlington, and Prince William. But don't forget that, the western Loudoun County, the rural Crescent in Prince William, or Clark County, or Fauquier County are kind of closed for business. They're beautiful, but it's making development leap over them and create a much more harsh commute. So really, it's all those things contribute to a difficult environment. And we're already seeing this year, Maryland is actually, the market's flatter than I thought it would be as far as new home activity. Maryland, though, is up 4%. Northern Virginia is down 4%. Well, Maryland doesn't have some of those constraints, though it's a more difficult regulatory environment as far as how long it takes to get a deal approved. But it's also about $50,000 cheaper on a new home. I mean, so there could be, it looks like there may already be occurring some migration to Maryland given the land constraints in Virginia.
Thanks. We'll shift to the other side first. Go ahead, ma'am.
Yes, Nancy Stewart's. Thank you so very much. This has really been fabulous. Help me understand when you're talking about Amazon and where they're going to be living and the impact to Arlington County, how do you see it also impacting the Tysons area close in Fairfax County? I mean, because there's so many apartments and condos and buildings going up there. How do you see them relating to that? Do you think that that would also be a potential for them, for some of the millennials to be living in those areas with the metro being so close to getting them over to Crystal City?
Sure. Yeah, why don't I start? Yes. I mean, the short answer is yes. I think it has increasing appeal, Tysons does, particularly for young people as a lot of new retail and restaurants begins to be developed,
Right.
Particularly adjacent to Silver Line stations. At the same time, I mean, we have seen values, both office asset values, multifamily asset values rising within a very close proximity to those stations, but there's still a lot of work to be done. I mean, we know Silver Line ridership is not meeting projections so far.
Right.
I think that with these potential new riders, that will probably change over the next 5 to 10 years. I think also as you see the Silver Line Phase 2 get extended all the way out to Dulles Airport and there's better connectivity throughout the region, that will also encourage more young people, well really people of all ages, to consider Tysons as an option. There has been considerable multifamily development in that part of the Northern Virginia market.
Exactly.
And so that also makes it more likely that we'll see some spillover of Amazon employees into Tysons.
So that would then be a very desirable coordinated effort between what's happening in the Crystal City area and Tysons, kind of doing a tie-in.
Yes, I think if the transit allows for it,
Exactly.
which now it does, then that, and you have the restaurant and retail to make it an attractive neighborhood, then yes, I think that allows for a tie-in.
Great,
I
thank you.
would say absolutely. I live in Tysons myself, and I'm
Oh,
a
you do?
millennial. So there's a case study right there. I don't work for Amazon. It's a quick shot down to Crystal City, though.
Right.
There's a number of restaurants, bars, lifestyle offerings in Tysons. I guess I technically live in the McLean side. Tysons is more urban, McLean's more suburban. The McLean Metro, like Sandy said, doesn't have the greatest ridership, but I would say that silver line, I think it's going to be tremendous for the area and for ridership into,
Right.
you can't go straight to Crystal City, you're going to have to transfer, but I would say I would see a number of employees living in that area. There's so many units coming online and that are already online there.
Exactly, thank you.
Yeah, so Christian, you spoke about for sellers, people potentially thinking about selling, it's important for them, to maximize exposure in order to, get the highest price, the highest, best terms, highest probability of close. Can you speak a little bit about the marketing process that you run to achieve, maximum exposure, and also talk a little bit about, your firm's capability to access out-of-market capital?
Sure. I would say, first off, whenever we sit down with a client who wants to sell, we analyze their situation and we customize the marketing process for them. But our traditional marketing process, when we list a property, a multifamily property, we put together a great brochure. We take it out to market for between 30 and 45 days. We also put it into our firm's proprietary, it's called MNet, it's Marcus & Millichap's system that connects all the agents in the firm, over 1,500 agents. So when we put it in that system, which is a quasi-MLS for commercial properties, agents from across the country, and we have offices in Canada also, they can blast out our deals to their buyers. Our local marketing consists of us calling, distributing email blasts, postcards to any and all owners of apartment buildings in the DC metro area. We have a proprietary database, our team does, of every owner, whether you own a 4-unit apartment building up to a 400-unit apartment building and beyond. You're in our database, and we reach out to owners or recent buyers that would purchase the property that we're selling. So it's very much targeted marketing, and we tend to generate between 10 to 15 offers on average when we're putting apartment buildings out to the market. So it's definitely a very refined approach that it tends to generate maximum value for clients.
Hi, I'm Kathy Rehill with Remax Distinctive. Thank you for your information. I was wondering, between the forecasted rise in interest rates and the demand, if you can talk a little bit about what kind of growth in resale pricing we can expect. Do we expect a steep curve, sort of a flat rise, consistent, sharp? Can you forecast that at all?
Yeah, so our forecast for the DC metro area as a whole is for roughly flat growth in prices in 2019. Obviously, so this forecast was put together before Amazon finalized their announcement. I think some of the excitement over Amazon coming will increase that a bit. But in general, with the mortgage rates rising, we have seen affordability bite into some of the housing demand. And so for that reason, we're expecting roughly flat price growth and sales growth. But we've come off of, 2017 was a record year, the best year for home sales in the last 10 years that we've seen. So to see a little bit of softening at this relatively high level is still a healthy housing market.
Can you forecast it all beyond 2019 with Amazon coming?
So we only do our forecast out 1 year ahead, but obviously, with Amazon coming, we're going to see the biggest impact in that local area. But as we move beyond that local area, we expect the market to be able to absorb this and to sort of grow in line with the overall economy. So, and I don't know if you've done any more specific forecasts.
We have not done forecasts on appreciation, but one of the things to take into consideration is that the timing of this is going to coincide with some downsizing that's going to occur naturally because of the demographic changes that are on tap for our market. So about 1 out of 5 homes, existing homes in our area, hasn't been on the market for more than 20 years because it's had the same owner. And a lot of those owners are 55 plus now, and there's going to be a little bit of an increase in the turnover. And the baseline for that, though, is that the Gen X is a little smaller, and the millennials are suffering from student debt issues, which doesn't lead to a very intuitive natural cycle that we've seen in the past. So we have other demographic disruptions that would affect this market, possibly even more so than Amazon.
In fact, to build on Jeanette's point about the turnover, especially in 55 plus, that actually does have some significant implications for the multi-housing market, because a lot of retirees are downsizing and in fact are looking to move into multifamily units, and they're leaving the 4 and 5 bedroom suburban single-family detached homes. So that actually is beginning to add to the potential demand for multifamily.
The resale home price appreciation has been very weak in this market, in my mind. It's been, Case-Shiller would say it's a little below 3% right now, which is baffling to me when there's so little supply out there. So it must be an affordability issue. Any other, there could be a number of things that could be playing into that, but it would be hard to imagine in a rising mortgage rate environment that it would get better than that. But that DC Metro, 3%'s not bad. It's below the long-term norm by my calculations. But it's among the Case-Shiller 20 markets that they track, it's dead last, DED last. So it's puzzling to me. It should be higher.
We tell our empty nesters, sell. Don't wait for a long time, sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, inventory is low, so any additional inventory that goes onto the market, particularly if it's, close to that median price point, is going to sell very quickly.
We'll take the last 2 questions on this side. Go ahead, sir.
Oh, hi, Paul Bergeron from National Apartment Association. Maybe I missed it, but is there much of a market for single-family rentals? There seem to be companies that are emerging that are purpose-built for housing that they're going to rent. And are there buyers coming in who are looking to buy houses in this area, the sole purpose of renting them out?
Sure there are.
I would say, I think that product type probably appeals most to Amazon workers who may be coming into this market from outside the region and are in a transition period where they're trying to figure out exactly where they want to live or which school district they want to send their kids to, and then probably 1, 2, 3 years down the line, they would end up buying.
Yeah, and I would add, this area is known for having some transient workers with the Defense Department here, the State Department here. So there is a healthy single-family rental market to serve, those types of renters. So that already exists, and we'll probably be able to easily absorb those transitioning Amazon workers.
Last question.
Yeah, so my question is, many of you alluded to a recession in the short term. How would that impact housing in Northern Virginia? The last recession had a significant impact in Northern Virginia compared to the country. So yeah, sorry to close on a sad note, but.
That's the deal.
That wasn't the question we had requested.
We're going to need another last question.
So the DC metro area, from a housing perspective, actually did better than most other parts of the country during the last recession, in large part because the government was here and provided a countercyclical boost to the economy. That said, there were still areas, particularly in the outer-lying suburbs, that were very hard hit by the last recession. Housing played a big role in the last recession. There was a lot of speculative building, which we don't see now. There was a lot of mortgage activity that is very different than what we see now. So underwriting standards weren't as high, documentation standards weren't as high, so that's different now. And I already mentioned the overbuilding versus underbuilding. We've been underbuilding not just for the last year, but essentially for almost the last decade. So it's a very different environment that we're in now versus before. Obviously, when you have an economic slowdown, housing is driven by economic fundamentals. People have to have income and believe that their jobs are secure to get into the housing market and make a for-sale purchase, which they're spreading out and financing generally over 30 years. So that's really fundamental to economic activity in the housing market. And if we see an economic slowdown, we will probably see somewhat of a slowdown or softening in the housing market. But because we're in a very different situation this time than before, the effects this time will be much, much different.
Let's end on an upbeat question.
I'm the wrong question.
Oh.
Okay, sorry about this. For the economists and those analyzing data and looking for leading indicators of potential market change, is the current bond yield curve inversion giving anybody angst that you can talk about? would
It's
like
not
to share.
inverted, yeah.
Well, it is in the 2s and the 5s, or something in the smaller notes.
That's right, though generally people look to the 2 and 10
Yeah.
as a much more reliable indicator of recession.
It's a yellow light, not a red one, I think, but I'd like your opinion.
So anytime you have a flattening yield curve, that suggests that there's a little bit less optimism about long-term prospects for growth versus what we're seeing today. I mean, it's natural to expect growth to slow when we've been, the economy has been growing beyond its potential. So GDP in the last couple quarters has been 3.5%. That's above what most people believe its long-term potential growth is. And so it's reasonable to expect that we would see a bit of a slowing in growth. Just because we have a slowing in growth doesn't mean we're moving into a recession. There's been a lot of talk about a recession coming in 2020. And it does make me wonder, if everybody's expecting it, is it really going to happen? I don't know. We'll check back in a couple years.
Just to add on to that, we're in the second longest business cycle going back to 1850s. And so as that business cycle ages, it just runs out of potential for that large percentage increase of gains. And so those growth rates just taper down a little bit.
So please join me in thanking our panelists. I'd like to invite you to our next event on February 7th with the AIA, District of Columbia, for designing extremes, building a resilient city, on hearing from weather experts, designers, and developers on new strategies on building for resiliency as the next project amenity and competitive advantage. On behalf of George Mason, the NVAR, and NVAA, thank you very much for attending.